Good morning, and thanks for joining us for our Farm Bill discussion. I'm Jim Mintert, Professor of Ag Economics here at Purdue and Director of the Center for Commercial Agriculture. And joining me in this morning's webinar is Michael Langemeier, who's also a professor and an Associate Director of the Center for Commercial Agriculture, and David Widmar, who's a Senior Research Associate also in the Center for Commercial Agriculture. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the key aspects of the Farm Bill, but that's an awfully broad topic, so we're going to narrow that down a little bit. And we're going to focus primarily on the workings and the mechanics of the ARC-County program and a little bit about the PLC program, and discuss how that program is designed, how it has worked so far, how we project it to work for the next couple of years, and that should maybe lead into some discussions as you think about future Farm Bill legislation going forward. So there's a lot more than that could be considered in the Farm Bill, but we're going to kind of narrow it down just a little bit this morning, and we'll have some further discussions as time goes on in future webinars. So with that, I thought it would be good to start off with a view of the Ag-Economy Barometer, which is a project that we've engaged in here at the Center for Commercial Agriculture, joint with the CME group. And the barometer measures farmer sentiment based on a survey that we do monthly of 400 farmers nationwide. It's a representative survey, correlates pretty well with the Census of Agriculture, and focuses on producers that are really producing the bulk of the nation's food. And so you can see, as you look at the barometer, sentiment among producers has been declining, especially since that late spring, early summer time frame. We've seen a pretty dramatic decline in producers' confidence. When you dig a little deeper into the barometer, you can see actually that the bulk of that decline in confidence among the nation's producers is really being driven by concerns about the future. There's been a little bit of a modest improvement in producer sentiment about the current situation, driven by a modest recovery in commodity prices this fall, and certainly in many places, especially in the Corn Belt, record yields. But if you look at it longer term and ask people questions 12 months ahead, 5 years ahead, there is an increasing amount of concern about the economic viability of the sector. So that's a concern. And David, I think you've looked at the prices a little bit and the revenues for cash crops.
So one of the big stories in agriculture today is declining net farm income. But when we look a little closer into the data, we can look at cash receipts by selected crops. It's on this graph that we're showing here today. So we start to see how some of the impacts of the slowdown we're seeing in the ag economy has varied across the different sectors. So let's look at corn to start off with. In blue, it's 2012 cash receipts. And then we see in gray 2016. There's been a steady decline over the last 5 years. And in fact, that in total, the decline is equal to 38%. So a pretty big contraction in what producers are receiving or their revenue on a per acre or in total basis. Another decline, not as severe, but another decline in soybean cash receipts of 20%. Wheat's been the big story here, especially on the Great Plains. Sharp contraction in prices has led to a 48% reduction in cash receipts for wheat sales, and cotton is also down 31%. So the pullback is varied across the U.S., and this is looking just at crops. We've also seen cutbacks in livestock in the last couple years, not peaking in 12, but peaking a little bit later in that cycle.
Yeah, and if you look at the fruit and nut situation, vegetables and melons, obviously the picture's significantly different in those two categories. But you know, as you look at that slide, David, and one reason we put the percentages on there, the scale tends to mask the change, and that decline in wheat has been huge, 48%. Over the span of that 5 years. So dramatic decline in cash receipts, prices driving most of that, and the concern obviously being expressed in the barometer in terms of lack of confidence about where we're headed from a future standpoint. So let's step back and think a little bit about the 2014 Farm Bill, and we're going to really just kind of walk through a little bit of a review of how that program was structured, kind of a reminder so that some of you probably weren't familiar with that, and some of you that were familiar with it maybe have forgotten some of the details. So in this Farm Bill, program choices were being made at the individual farm level and by crop, and that's something that historically we didn't do in Farm Bills. If you think back over the long history of Farm Bills, that's a relatively recent change. 76% of the base acres in the nation wound up being enrolled in the ARC-County program. 23% of those base acres enrolled in the PLC program, the Price Loss Coverage program. If you think about it, the 2014 Farm Bill was really designed to provide both support assistance, which has been a more traditional approach to Farm Bill legislation, but also provided what I'd characterize maybe as and some observers have characterized as a transition payment. And Michael, you want to address that a little bit and tell us what we mean by that?
Yeah, when we were looking at this Farm Bill in 2014, it was pretty obvious that there was a pretty good chance that for corn and soybean producers that they were going to get some payment in 14 and 15, and 16, 17, and 18 looked like they were going to be smaller or no payments at all. And so it was pretty obvious at the beginning of the Farm Bill that the payments were going to be front-loaded.
Yeah, and so the implication was we effectively had built a program designed to provide some payments in the early years. The idea or the thought process behind that was that provided an opportunity to take those payments and use that to get your financial house in order a little bit and prepare for a time frame when payments were going to be either very small or perhaps even zero. I'm not sure how many people actually treated it that way, but that was one of the thought processes, I think, behind that bill.
And that was especially true for the ARC-County at the county level. That front loading really occurred in that. And we're going to dig a little bit into that here in a few slides. But
yeah, and that's a good point. If you signed up for the PLC program, you really weren't buying into that concept. The PLC program was more built on an expectation that prices might decline significantly and had a higher likelihood of producing significant payments in the out years. So that's a good point. About 3/4 of the people that signed up bought into the idea of a program that front-loaded the payments. Roughly 1/4 of the people signing up bought into the idea of a program that would provide some significant downside price protection in the out years especially. So we had, if you think about the way the program was structured, it produced some pretty high benchmark revenues in that 09 to 13 time frame, which in turn were used to calculate payments or potential payments in 14 and 15. And so as a result, we had some relatively high benchmarks for 14 and 15, and that's how we effectively concluded that we were going to see some significant payments those first couple of years. But the use of Olympic averaging on both prices and yields pulls those benchmark revenues down in 16 through 18, and that's how we were able to project that those payments would be declining significantly. We're going to talk more about those Olympic averages because there's some issues around
before
that.
we get into that, Olympic averages would be 5 years in the removal of the high and the low, and then you average the three kind of in the middle of the road. Is that?
Yeah, so you're using 3 years of data. You grab 5 years of data, but you actually only use 3 of it to compute the average for both prices and yields. And that creates some issues that we're going to talk about later with respect to especially yields.
Before we get into that, just think about that. If you have 2 high yielding years, that's going to be in the Olympic average because you're only going to drop one of those. Conversely, if you have 2 relatively low years that have in terms of yield, one of those is going to be in the Olympic average, and so that really drives some of the difference in payments across counties.
And can give you some pretty big changes in those yields,
Yes.
and we'll see that later with one of the charts. So Michael, just as a kind of a reminder, kind of walk us through the ARC program, the ARC-County program.
Yeah. First of all, it was a one-time irrevocable choice by crop in 2014 to 2018, and so even though PLC might look more attractive today than it did when we were signing up in 2014, you can't switch. ARC-County payments occur when actual crop revenue is below the ARC revenue guarantee. The ARC revenue guarantee was computed with benchmark prices, which we'll talk more about here in the next couple slides, and also benchmark yields, which we'll also talk about in the next couple slides. The ARC-County guarantee was 86% of county ARC benchmark revenue, so you have to apply that 86% to the ARC benchmark revenue to get the guarantee. It's very important to note that coverage was capped at 10%, at 10% of the ARC benchmark revenue, and what that means is even if there was a very large difference between the benchmark revenue and the actual revenue, that difference was capped at 10%. That was very important in quite a few counties across the Corn Belt for corn in 2015. We hit the cap in numerous counties across the Corn Belt. So that's very important to note that, and that's why it was called a shallow loss. there would be deep losses in some of those counties in 2015 if that wasn't capped. And that, of course, was for budget reasons. So they could predict they could predict a little closer what this was going to cost. As I indicated, the ARC-County benchmark revenue was based on Olympic averages of county yields and crop year average prices. We'll dig in a little deeper into the implication of using county yields to calculate these Olympic averages. And then a final thing here, payment was made on 85% of base acres. Notice the wording there, base acres. And so it didn't matter if you grew 50% corn and 50% soybeans. It wasn't based on what you're currently planting. It was based on the base acres, your historical base acres.
And one other thing I think to think about, Michael, you mentioned the 10% cap and the shallow loss provision. Part of that was driven by the idea was that crop insurance provides protection against deeper losses. And the concern in the industry was this idea of how could we protect and manage our way through some of these shallow losses. And so that was conceptually behind that, as well as the budgetary issue.
Yes, and we should repeat something that we said in 2014. Just because you have crop insurance did not mean you didn't need to sign up for the ARC-County or didn't need the ARC-County. They really were separate decisions.
Yeah, very much so. PLC program?
The price loss coverage was much simpler. Here we looked at corn reference price of $3.70, a soybean reference price of $8.40, and a wheat reference price of $5.50. Certainly, those prices, prices of corn and wheat, we've seen below those reference prices. That's certainly the case, and there's some expectations they might stay below for those two. For soybeans, we knew that in 2014 that was a relatively low reference price, and so that's why being able to sign up for ARC-County and PLC by crop was important. Now, having said that, a lot of people chose ARC-County in the Corn Belt for all three of these crops, but they could have chose ARC-County and PLC by crop. The important thing here is if the price did drop below these reference price, a payment was made based on the base acres.
Okay? And so the trigger price in corn, for example, was $3.70 a bushel.
Yes.
And what was the trigger? What was we actually measuring? It was a market year average price.
Yes.
And can you
Very
talk
good.
a little bit about that?
The marketing year average price would take the price from September to August, and it would calculate the price from September to August, and then we'd compare that to this corn reference price. So it wasn't just the fall harvest price or anything like that. And so you had to have an extended period of relatively low prices in order to be below these reference prices.
And it's representative of kind of what an average price that
Yes.
all farmers across the country would have received. And so
Yes.
crops harvested this fall, their market year average price is going to go all the way into August, you said, of
Yes.
2017. So
Yeah.
it takes a long time for us to actually get a firm number on what that.
And the weights are heavier during
Correct.
the harvest period in the early spring when a lot of sales occur. So that's important to note that too. And so it's a little bit complicated, but that's the way that the ARC-County and PLC worked. They're based on marketing year average prices.
And the reason behind that, of course, was the fact, and as Michael indicated, they are weighted averages, meaning that they are attempting to be reflective of what producers nationwide are actually receiving for those crops. So if you're thinking about a program that's calculating benchmark revenues and making payments based on differences between perceived or actual revenues and benchmarks, using a price series that's weighted by volume like that makes a lot of sense. But I think your point is it creates a long delay.
Very long delay.
Very long delay. And that's a challenge in terms of cash flows in particular.
On the flip side of that, though, by using a national average price like that, you could take a price from the WASDE report, for example. You take their midpoint price, and that could be an estimate for you of what that marketing year average price was going to be. And so I think it was somewhat transparent. By using that national price, it was for planning purposes, it was pretty easy to get some forecasts of what that marketing year average price was going to be, and then you could change that monthly as that price changed. So there was an advantage of using that price, I think.
All right, let's take a look at these prices because I think that's obviously, as we've kind of already indicated, that is one of the issues. So here are corn prices, marketing year averages, and the benchmarks starting in 2014. And I think that's important to look at those for just a minute and just maybe absorb that a little bit because you can see the peak in prices back in 12 when we saw a marketing year average that was approaching $7 a bushel. Prices did drop in 13 with a marketing year average that was just a little under $4.50. And at the time we were talking about this farm bill, we were already talking about what the projections were for 2014, and we might not have had that 2014 number exact, but we really, and I say all the economists that were looking at this farm bill, the projections for 2014 were pretty close. And so one of the things that allowed us to do, Michael, was really anticipate what was taking place, what those marketing year average prices were going to be in 14 and 15, right?
Yeah, definitely, and you can see why you can see from this chart why those prices were relatively high compared to where we are today. Because remember, we're using the Olympic average there, and so for 2014, we're using 2009 through 2013 yields. You take out 2009, you take out 2012. You still have a pretty high price there when you average 2010, 2011, and 2013, and so we can see mechanically why those benchmark prices were relatively high in 14 and 15, and we can also see why 15 wasn't known precisely, but we knew it was going to be close to that because again, looking at those historical prices, we knew which year was likely to drop out.
Yeah, so we were going to drop by definition 09 and likely replace it with 2014.
Yes.
So that allowed us to project pretty closely
Pretty
what
close.
that 15 benchmark was going to be, and in turn allowed us to estimate that in many locations, significant payments were likely in those first couple of years. Now the right-hand side of that slide was also anticipated, maybe not the exact magnitude, but nevertheless the trend was identified pretty well. So that was how we anticipated this program playing out. Significant payments in many locations the first couple of years, the likelihood of payments being made in the out years dropping pretty dramatically. 16, a little bit of an issue. Some places are going to receive payments in 16, some are not. But as you get to 17 and 18, the likelihood of payments under the ARC-County program are very low, right?
Let's talk a little bit about where we got the 16, 17, and 18 prices so it's very clear. The 16 price for both corn and soybeans, we're going to show the soybean chart next, comes from the latest WASDE report, and that's the midpoint price projection by USDA. The 2017 and 2018 are a University of Missouri FAPRI forecast from August. And so that's what we're using for the 2017-2018. Producers could also use futures price adjusted for basis for that 17 and 18, but here we're using FAPRI prices.
And again, as you look at those out years, there's going to be some error in those forecasts, but it would have to be a big error for it to trigger
Yes.
results that are significally different than what we're projecting.
2016 payments are quite sensitive, and we'll show that here in a little bit, are quite sensitive to the prices in particular. 17 and 18, not so much.
Not so much, that's right. And again, it's because the
It's
Olympic
because of
average
how
formula.
fast we're dropping that benchmark price from 16 to 17. We got 50-cent drop in 16 and even a larger drop in 2017.
So it's just the mechanics of
Yes.
how that Olympic average is calculated that drives that and makes that result likely.
It's worth pointing out on that corn slide that as we approach 2017, 2018, we're getting closer to that PLC trigger price or
Definitely.
that benchmark price they offer, that $3.70 per bushel. So, and we kind of talked about this several years ago, that as we moved away from the high price period in 10, 11, 12, and we started replacing with lower prices, we would kind of close in on a lower price point. And by 2018, we'll get close to that PLC.
Yeah, and since you brought that up, I think it's good to point out, we did some calculations in that 14-15 time frame when people were going through the sign up and trying to help people make a choice between the ARC-County and the PLC program. And we estimated how low corn prices would have to fall before the PLC program would, over the 5 years, wind up producing more revenue versus the ARC-County program. And even though, as you point out, we're getting in the ballpark of that reference price, it turns out you have to drive prices significantly below that because of the front-loaded nature of the ARC-County program those first 2 years. So even though prices in those out years are getting down either at or maybe a little bit below, perhaps, depending on the forecast you look at, the reference price, from a 5-year standpoint, people that signed up for the ARC-County program in most situations are probably going to wind up collecting more revenue under the ARC-County program than they would have if they signed up for the PLC program. So I think that's an important point to remember. You and I had a discussion yesterday. If you were signing up today, looking out 5 years, you would reach a different conclusion. The PLC program, if you were signing up today for the next 5 years, is likely the program that would more likely generate more revenue to payments to producers than the ARC-County program.
And that's going to be very important for producers and policymakers to keep in mind as they talk about the next upcoming farm bill, is that given today's environment, if we just reauthorize the current bills, PLC would be a little more attractive and a little more in play than what it was a few years ago because of this price and market year average price environment.
That's right. We'd see a lot of people that last time signed up for ARC-County this time going forward, would probably sign up for PLC. Let's take a look at the soybean chart, Michael.
The soybeans is not quite as extreme here in terms of the declines that were anticipated or the declines that we're actually seeing, because soybean prices have held up a little better than corn. You compare it to what we were forecasting 2 years ago, but it's a similar story. We knew that 14 and 15 were going to be relatively high benchmark prices because of how the Olympic average was computed, and we knew that there was going to be some declines as we moved into 16, 17, and 18.
Yeah, the physical appearance of that chart makes it look a lot like the corn chart. It is like that in the sense that the prices are going down, but the magnitude of decline is smaller than what we have seen in corn. Yeah. And we'll see that again here in a couple of slides further down.
Another one thing we want to point out here, as I said, soybeans have held up a little bit better. Soybean prices have held up a little bit better than corn. We almost don't have it on the chart here, but you'd have to get to 840 or below before you'd have PLC payment. And so we're not anticipating prices being that low. So if you signed up for PLC and soybeans, you may never get a payment in this farm bill.
Good point. Let's take a look at the yield situation, because that's one that I think we have some reservations about how that's being calculated and the impact it's having on program payments. So, Michael, you've looked at, in particular, a case farm, a very representative farm for White County, Indiana, which for people that aren't familiar with Indiana, that's here in kind of north central, west central Indiana, a relatively high productivity county in Indiana. And you've taken a closer look at these yields, so why don't you walk us through that a little bit?
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out, and I think we're going to have it on the slide here in a little bit, but the trend-adjusted yield is approximately 180 for White County. So it's a very good producing
And when you say
county.
that, you mean for 2016?
Yes.
So the trend-adjusted yield, which is not on that chart,
Yes.
for 2016 would be 180 bushels. The actual yield...
The actual benchmark yield is closer to 160. So what happened here? Why is this Olympic average so different than the trend-adjusted yield? Well, what happened here is we had two low yield years. These are rather extreme years for this particular county. 2012, less than 120, and 2015 was about 130. And so when you do the Olympic average, you only drop one of those. That tends to drive that benchmark yield down. And of course, that makes a difference when you're calculating a benchmark revenue.
And so one way to think about that is the program produces a benchmark revenue based on that benchmark price we just discussed a minute ago and then the benchmark yield that we've got on the screen. But that is not the same benchmark revenue that most producers would be projecting, for example, when they sit down in January and make their crop plans for the year. They would be looking at that trend-adjusted yield
Yes.
times perhaps a price that's actually fairly close to that benchmark price.
Yeah, when we develop budgets or we look at budgets and extension workshops, we tend to use a trend-adjusted yield in the budgets, and then we use a marketing year average price similar to what we have in this chart. And so, like you indicate, Jim, the big difference here is we're using the Olympic average yield rather than that trend yield. And so it makes quite a bit of difference in the payments.
So one thing I'll point out here, it's really kind of fascinating to look at this. So in 14 and 15, based on the 5-year Olympic average, we had a benchmark yields of around 170. Mm-hmm. Then we threw in another low yield in 15, and it brought us down to 160. So we pulled 10 bushel out of that payment multiplier. And then we have a really good year coming in 16, and then your graphs here represent that trend yield again in 17 and 18. So given a couple years above trend, we're going to pull this thing back up closer to 190. So down 10 bushel, and then we're going to, over time, if we have average yields, we're going to work that higher, close to 185, 190. So large deviations and variations within one county over 5 years and how this benchmark yield's varying.
Now, if you look at some counties in southern Indiana, the exact opposite is true. Rather than being below the trend yield in 2016, they're above. And that also has a big impact on their potential payments.
So what we're talking about, and I think, David, we've discussed this at length before we got on the program, this is an interesting situation. We're using initially 5 years of data, then lopping off the high and the low, calling it the Olympic average, using 3 years of data as an approximation for what we typically think of as kind of a long-run projection for revenue at the individual farm or at the individual county level. And you've got a term for this. This is a what?
I've been calling it a bit of a lottery because if you have several good years in a row or several poor years in a row, it starts to work for you or against you in a pretty big way.
And it differs quite a bit from crop insurance. In crop insurance, we use 10 years of data as a way to establish effectively a benchmark yield. And we've got some adjustments in there. You can make some adjustments for really low yields, occasional zero yield or something like that. You can use a plug yield. But nevertheless, it's a longer data set and isn't subject to the kind of gyrations that what we're showing on the screen. And that's, from our standpoint, somewhat problematic in terms of how these benchmark revenues are calculated, and in turn, the payments that are generated based on the differences between perceived revenues and actual revenues. I've got the soybean chart on the screen now, and if you look at that, the picture is similar. It's not identical, though.
It's not as extreme because soybeans were more resilient. The yields were more resilient in both 2012 and 2015, and so we weren't near as far below the trend yield in soybeans as we were in corn. But nevertheless, if you look at 2016, it's a little hard to tell on this graph here, but the benchmark yield for 2016 is below the trend.
Yeah. So let's take a look at benchmark revenues. We've actually computed those. Again, this is for the White County, Indiana representative situation that you've been working with extensively. And look at how those revenues are changing. In 2014, that benchmark revenue, $783 per acre. 2017, we're projecting that could be down to $571. That's a decline of 27% over that 4-year span. On the soybean side, 2014, that projected benchmark was $538. 2017, $491, down 9%. And again, that gets at this issue of some differences on the soybean side versus the corn side. You might want to address that a little more completely, Michael.
Yeah, it goes back to the fact that soybean prices have held up a little bit better than corn, and so that's certainly a factor here. But in White County, also what's going on here is that yield impact. That yield impact is impacting the benchmark revenue adversely for corn in these out years.
Mm-hmm. So you get some differentials there based on both the yield and the price scenario, but I just wanted to point out that difference in the decline between those two.
And remember, these benchmark revenues are compared to the actual revenue, and so we can see why it's going to be rather difficult to get a payment in White County in 2017, 2018, particularly for corn, but also for soybeans, is that benchmark revenue is getting down there fairly low.
Right.
So prices would have to really crash or yields would have to be really low in order to get a payment, and we don't want either one of those things to happen, so we don't necessarily want a payment in those out years.
So let's look at the base price scenario, and then we're going to look at a couple of charts that kind of are driven by this. So
what I'd like to do here is look at the sensitivity of the 2016 ARC-County payment for a corn-soybean rotation to price and yield. And so I've got this chart just to show you the base prices I'm using. And so I'm using November WASDE midpoint price projections. For corn, that was $3.30. For soybeans, that was $9.20. And so the average, using those base prices and the benchmark yields, for the rotation, the average ARC-County payment would be $5 per acre. Notice how big a drop that is from 2014 and 2015 for this particular county. And then also notice here, we're not focusing on the earnings here, but even with these prices and with that ARC-County payment, you're looking at some pretty big losses in 2016. But even with that fairly big ARC-County payments in 2014, 2015, we had even larger losses than what we're seeing under these very low prices in 2016. So some people might be scratching their head here. What's going on? Why is the gross revenue look so, even with low prices, why is the gross revenue look so good for 2016? I factored in here a 10% higher soybean and corn yield than trend. that's very important, and I clearly indicate that. That's kind of the state projection right now, is that corn and soybean yields are going to be 10 to 15% higher, probably a little less than 10% for corn, a little more than 10% for soybeans. And so I factored in 10% above trend in my revenue figures.
And I guess this is a good time to point out, NASS won't release their county yield estimates until late February, and USDA doesn't necessarily have to use the NASS yields. In fact, this past year they didn't. The adjusted yields were not released until, I've forgotten exactly, late summer.
Yes.
So we don't actually know what the county yields are. We're projecting. That's why you're using the state numbers to project what's taking place at the county level.
But for planning purposes, we're going to have a slide that's referencing a spreadsheet from the University of Illinois. For planning purposes, you could use mid-year price projections from the USDA to see what your payments might be for 16, 17, and 18, and you could assume that your yields are going to be so much above trend for 16, and then use trend yield in 17 and 18. And so it is possible for planning purposes to make projections, then update those.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that these are projections. They're subject to a lot of changes, both what the USDA posts as a county yield and what market year average prices end up becoming. So as farmers start to close out 2016, and make their plans and are working on their income and balance statements and meeting with their lenders, there could be a big unknown when they reflect on this year. What could those ARC-County payments be? And it's going to take 11 months before we actually know that number. And that makes it really hard for producers. They can estimate and project, but it's an unknown. I think that's really tricky with this program.
And it's going to be, even right before planning, we'll have a little better estimate, because then we'll know what the county yield was, and we'll have a little better idea what the marketing year average price is going to be. But until then, we're really going to be bouncing around a little bit in terms of what that projected payment is going to be. And so that's a very good point, David.
Yeah, and so especially county yields, until NASS comes out with their estimates in February, it's a little bit of a guessing game with respect to what that county yield's going to be, right?
Because a couple bushel on corn can really push you. You said the sensitivity, it can push you out of that payment window quickly.
And the market year average price, I mean, it's $3.30 right now. I mean, it wouldn't be a stretch of an imagination to think that that could increase 10%. I mean, it's possible, certainly possible. I think the range on that, correct me if I'm wrong, David, I think the USDA range was like 3 to 360.
Right.
And so a pretty wide range there, and so it could be 10% below or 10% above. As we're going to see on the next graph here, that makes a huge difference in your payment.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at that. So we wanted to put this slide up so you knew what was driving this next chart. And
I was just too tempted to talk about that slide for a long time because I really like that slide. But really, that slide is so that we can talk more intelligently about this particular figure. So remember the base prices here. This is for corn soybean rotation. That's very important to note. So I've got a rotation here, not just corn, not just soybeans. Remember the base prices were $3.30 for corn and $9.20 for soybeans. And so let's say we have that 10% higher yield and the base prices are materialized. You see that little tiny gray bar under the base price on the bottom there? That's where my $5 per acre comes from. In order to get a higher ARC-County payment, either the price is going to have to be quite a bit lower or the yield's going to have to be quite a bit lower. I think the yield's probably not going to be quite a bit lower, and so in order to get a higher ARC-County payment, we're going to have prices below $3.30 corn and $9.20 soybeans.
Yeah, so that's a lot of variability there, and kind of David's point, some minor variations in your forecast.
Let's just look at this $3 to $3.60 range that USDA used in the November WASDE report. At $3, that's the 10% lower price. The ARC-County payment for this rotation would be $50. At $3.30 and $9.20, the base price, it's $5. At 10% higher price, it disappears. And so that, using the range that USDA has provided in the WASDE report, anything from 0 to 50. So we're not really narrowing down into what the payment's going to be.
So for a little bit of clarity there, when the 10% lower price the way you've built this chart would be 10% lower on corn and soybeans. Okay, so that's important to remember.
So but thinking about a farm in Indiana who has maybe marketed their grain through the summer and has it priced out through the winter, so they know their bushels, they know their price. They're sitting here looking at this saying, I have 1,000 acres, and I'm going to go meet with my lender in a few months, and I'm going to tell him, well, I'm probably going to get a very small ARC payment, but I could get $60,000, that's $60 an acre, or I could get zero. There's some things out of their control right now that will ultimately determine what size of payment they might get. And that's tricky, I think.
Yes, it is.
That's a challenge. Michael, we've also spent some time talking outside this program about the variability across counties, and you've taken a look at that. These are some Indiana counties. We're going to look at this for corn, and then we're going to look at it for soybeans. You've also looked at it in more than just Indiana, so I wanted to point that out. But take a look at these numbers.
First of all, let's talk about where these counties are at in Indiana for those of you that are not familiar with Indiana. Elkhart is in north central Indiana, right next to the Michigan border. Jay County is in east central Indiana. Knox and Posey are in southwest Indiana, and so I want to pay particularly close attention to those two. And then White County, we've been talking about just north of Lafayette here in west central Indiana. But look at the differences in payments, and let's start with 14 and 15. You know, Jay County got some pretty sizable payments for 14 and 15, as well as White County. So that's kind of they're kind of central or a little bit above the central band of Indiana. It's got some pretty good payments. Conversely, Elkhart, Knox, and Posey got almost no payment in 2014. Elkhart got no payment in 2015. So just huge differences in payments across these counties. And what was this based on?
Yields.
Yields. The Olympic average yield. It all depended on how that Olympic average yield is computed. It all depended on how that Olympic average yield compared to the trend yield.
And so thinking about that again, the way the program is designed, we're using that Olympic average yield as a means of approximating a longer term, truthfully a trend adjusted yield. And I guess we're kind of questioning whether or not that's a good approach to doing these yields. It's really created some variability in these benchmark revenues and in turn variability in the payments going out. And that would be okay from our perspective as economists if in fact that was reflective of what was truly taking place relative to a longer term benchmark. But we have some issues there, I think, with respect to that program design.
Another thing I think is really critical to point out here is that in all these counties over the last 3 years, 14, 15, 16, there has been a large payment. Large yield would have offset those payments, but there have been large payments. Looking to 2017, there are 2 counties, Elkhart and Posey, that have small payments. In 2018, no expected payments. So it would take prices or a yield loss very significant to trigger these payments. So if farmers have been out there and producers have been out there benefiting, and they have been benefiting, but if you've been planning on these government payments, there's kind of a cliff here. These payments aren't going to really show up in 17. They're not going to show up in 18 without a large yield hit.
Yeah, very good point. And the reason I wanted to focus a little bit on Knox and Posey, the reason I've got them both on the graph here, they're very close geographically in southwest Kansas. And you can see even the difference.
Southwest Indiana.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, southwest Indiana. I did spend some time in Kansas, so I do make that mistake once in a while. Thank you for catching that. But look at the difference between those 2 counties. Knox got a small payment in 2014, Posey got nothing. $13 difference in 2015, a 20-year difference in 2016. So counties very close geographically. The payments are varying quite a bit there.
Yeah, and again, it gets back to that Olympic average approach to doing the yields.
Now we go to soybeans. The soybeans is a very interesting, looking at these 5 counties in Indiana, but soybeans vary tremendously across the Corn Belt. Parts of Iowa got very small payments in terms of soybeans. Southern Illinois, southern Indiana, very small payments. In some counties, no payments in 2015. We can see Posey County there. The far south Indiana got no payment in 2015. So soybeans are even more variable than the corn payments.
Yeah, and again, it gets back to how we're calculating those yields to generate those benchmark revenues.
I should note here that let's go back to that corn chart. I can't help myself here, Jim. In White County in particular, but my guess is also Jay and Knox. We're at the cap. Those were capped.
Yeah, right.
And then also when you look at soybeans, I'm pretty sure that J, Knox, and White are at the cap, or very close to it. And so that's important to point out. Those payments would have been even larger
Right,
if they
without
wouldn't
that
have
10% payment
cap.
Yeah, good point. You mentioned earlier that it's possible to project payments using the spreadsheet, and I wanted to highlight that spreadsheet for a second. So the University of Illinois and the FarmDoc team, in their Fast Tools section of their website, has the ARC-County PLC spreadsheet out there, and you can use that to project as you go through the year what those payments are likely to be. As David pointed out, the prices can vary, the yields can vary. We can plug those in the spreadsheet and generate estimates in a very straightforward fashion. And you can update it as the year goes on. So we find that to be a useful tool. We'd recommend having a copy of that. So the way to find that is simply go to the University of Illinois' FarmDoc Fast Tools section, and it's pretty easy to find and download and run. It's an Excel spreadsheet, so you need a copy of Excel.
And the cells that are in yellow, those are, maybe it's obvious, but we should point it out. The cells in yellow, those are the things that you're changing or updating. And so as you have more information on what you think 16, 17, and 18 yields are going to be, you can update that, and the payments may or may not change depending on if you're budging away from zero there for 17 and 18. And then also you can enter your forecast of the market year average price.
So that kind of wraps up our presentation. I think what we've done here this morning is we've walked through how the program worked, the sign-up process, the decision-making process. We've shown you a little bit how it's played out. A lot of our viewers are probably familiar with how it played out on their individual farm, but a lot of people probably weren't familiar with how the variability is played out. We illustrated that mostly here in Indiana, but we've looked at it a little bit in some other states as well. And there's some challenges going forward as you think about program design. And I think one of the things we highlighted most clearly today is the impact of using these Olympic average yields is somewhat problematic from our standpoint. And as we think about future Farm Bill deliberations, David, that's probably something that needs to certainly be discussed at length.
Yeah, definitely when we think about, because if you have 2 years of low yields and you've probably triggered a payment, this tool is less effective for you when you look at the long run average. And on the other hand, if you have a couple good years, the tool becomes more effective for you. So it kind of creates some, I think, disappointment among farmers when they think about how much this variability impacts them.
And Michael, I guess the other thing we've highlighted here is as we look ahead these next couple of years, this program, as anticipated, is going to provide very modest or very little in the way of income support in these out years in 17 and 18, at least on most locations around the Corn Belt.
Yeah, most locations get a zero corn and soybean payment in 2017. We did illustrate some counties that potentially are going to get some 2017 payments, but that's because their yields were really high recently, and so the payments were pushed into 2017. 2018, I haven't ran into any scenarios where a person would get a payment if they were a corn and soybean producer in 2018.
And so I think the last point is if we start to think about future Farm Bill legislation, if we were to re-up this program without any significant program design changes, one of the things that we would expect to see under the current price scenario would be a difference in the way people sign up. Last time, roughly 3/4 of the people signed up for the ARC-County program, and about 1/4 signed up for the PLC program. If you were doing that today, looking ahead for the next 5 years, it'd probably be flip-flopped. We'd probably see somewhere in the ballpark of 3/4 of the people signing for the PLC program, maybe even more than that, and a relatively small percentage of people looking at the ARC-County program. The fact that the ARC-County program was front-loaded with payments and it was easy to see that was the case made that program attractive at that point in time. If we projected going forward, that program would not be very attractive in most locations for most people going forward.
And the wheat price situation is in such a way, the prices are so low that that PLC reference price was $5.50 per bushel. We're well below that at the U.S. level. So there's very large payments being made, especially out in the West, in the Great Plains, for producers who did sign up for PLC under the wheat crop.
So with that, Michael, do you have one more comment?
Yes, for the economists out there, I'm hoping if we do have something similar to this ARC-County PLC decision in the upcoming Farm Bill, a couple things I think need to be done to see how we could change the calculation of these yields a little bit. And so I'd like to see someone do some work related to what if we don't use a 5-year Olympic average? What if we use something that was a little bit more longer term? How would that impact the payments? I think another thing I think would be interesting, rather than using county yields, what if we use district yields or state yields? How would that impact the payments? Because I think there's some design issues that we could start to look at just in case that we have a similar program next time, just tweaks. To see if that would even out some of these differences in payments across counties.
And that's a good point. We didn't dwell on it here this morning, but one of the issues that's been discussed a lot when the program was passed and as it's been playing out here the last couple of years is the accuracy of county yields. That's probably not one of the most accurate numbers out there using the procedures that are in place to estimate those county yields. I think most of us have more confidence in district level yields and certainly state level yields than we do perhaps in the individual county yields. And so the variability in payments being triggered by differences in those yield estimates at that county level are a little bit of a concern just because of the accuracy of the data.
A little troublesome.
Yeah. So, all right, with that, we really thank you for joining us today on our webinar. We do have another webinar coming up soon. Our next webinar will be December 9th when we do our 2017 Ag Business Climate webinar. So we hope you'll join us for that. If you register on the website, you'll get an email from us with some reminders and the link to the webinar itself so you can watch it live. And of course, we always send a reminder that shows you that you could catch the webinar the recorded version on YouTube. More information available on our website for the Center for Commercial Ag, purdue.edu/commercialag. And of course, the Ag Barometer, and we showed that slide at the very beginning, but we have a lot of information on the Ag Barometer website. We ask a lot of questions that we didn't talk about today and that you would probably find of interest. So purdue.edu/agbarometer for that information. And with that, thanks for joining us on behalf of Purdue Extension and the Center for Commercial Agriculture. Have a good day.